called a dramatic pause. Welcome, everybody, once again. I'm Nina Easton, and we're here to talk more on trade. We've got a fantastic panel, all of whom have deep international experience in trade. I want to tell you a little bit about each one before we get into the discussion. We're going to get a little personal here. Nando is president of international for UPS, but he's a lifer at UPS. You started doing packages back when you were in college.
Right out of college, yeah.
That's right out of I love that. Mike Froman, he doesn't remember this, but I remember meeting with him when he was the U.S. Trade Ambassador, and he had stars in his eyes about TPP and all these great things that were going to happen under the Obama administration. He's now vice chair and president of strategic growth for MasterCard, and congratulations to Michael. He just joined the Disney board. Yes. Wonderful. Annette was a Cape Breton farm girl who went on to become one of the most important business leaders in Canada. She expanded Home Depot from 19 to 179 stores here, which is incredible. And she's now CEO of Enerstor. Did I say it correctly?
Correct.
I'll let you say it.
Energy Storage Development
Enerstor, excellent. We first want to take the conversation about the new NAFTA a little bit farther. I think it's fascinating, first of all, that NAFTA, even the name suggests different approaches. NAFTA was the North American Free Trade Agreement suggesting a free trade zone, and now we have the USMCA, meaning 3 different countries lined up in this name, none of us can say. But Annette, I wanted to start with you. It's interesting, you wrote a business book called Bet on Me about leadership. It was one of the top business books that year when it came out. And what did you learn? You were a NAFTA advisor.
Correct. Yep.
During this past crazy year.
Yeah.
What did you learn about leadership from the other side?
Well, I learned leadership from, can I talk a little bit about this side first? Minister Freeland. An amazing leader, and calm, cool, direct, really did her homework. The whole negotiating team were extraordinarily smart. On the other side, my experience working with, between US and Canadian leadership is that you have to have your homework done. You have to be direct when you need to be.
You have to be direct.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, no diplomacy there going on.
Well, look, I think you can't take diplomacy out of the Canadian citizen. Okay. It's who we are. But we can be extraordinarily direct and have the information to back us up. And that's what she did extraordinarily well. It was a very difficult negotiation. And in the end, I think our government knew where the line had to be drawn, and it was communicated clearly. And at the end, we came up with a deal that is not a bad deal for Canada.
Winners and losers, Michael, in this process?
I think everybody's a winner in that the deal got done. It was better than the alternative of not having a deal at all. I think it built on the foundation that had been previously agreed to in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. A lot of the text comes from the TPP that Canada and Mexico were part of with the US before, and that's, I think, a good foundation. I think when you look beyond that, the jury will be out on some of the key issues, like the auto sector, where I think we won't know for years what impact it actually has, whether companies decide to ignore NAFTA or USMCA and pay the tariff, or whether it does raise wages and production in the United States and Canada, in which case the cars will be more expensive. And auto experts I've talked to said, well, that might actually lead to fewer cars being produced and fewer workers working in that sector. We just won't know. And I think there'll be a lot of factors.
We could lead to job loss. Is that what you're suggesting?
I think we won't. There's so many factors that affect the auto industry, including the rise of autonomous vehicles and the rise of the shared economy, that I'm not sure we're going to ever be able to see exactly what the impact of the USMCA is. But certainly to the degree that the Trump administration was seeking to drive more manufacturing activity to the US, which I think is a goal that every administration shares. It has the potential to do that, but it also has the potential to be counterproductive.
So, Nando, I'd love to talk to you about drones, but I'm not going to. We'll get to that later.
Yeah, I'm sure that's a common
Drone
question.
delivery is pretty common, UPS. But what's your sense of how companies, Canadian companies, did in the new agreement?
So, you know, we definitely support the new agreement. We think, and being Canadian, you know, we've been trading for a long time. And in fact, companies are going to need to adapt and become a lot more agile as things change really quickly. And it's no different than when we first started operations here in my hometown around 43 years ago. There was no NAFTA. There was no WTO, but still goods crossed the border. And we think that, you know, from our company perspective, one of the challenges we face, especially when we're looking at a great opportunity, but one of the biggest challenges, which is crossing borders and customs rules and providing service to customers. It's a $1 trillion opportunity for our business by 2020. E-commerce was not written or not modern enough in terms of the old NAFTA agreement, where some of those things now have been addressed in the new modernized version of the new NAFTA. So from a UPS perspective, you know, we're definitely excited about the opportunity it brings small, medium-sized customers in all three countries being able to trade with those other customers in different markets. And that just wasn't the case prior to the agreement. Smaller customers have a hard time navigating through all of those rules, and a lot of them have been modernized and cleared up for them. So it should help those customers really expand their businesses. So we're really bullish.
So we hear this like bullish, update, modernize, but there must have been losers. I mean, come on, I mean, trade agreements are about winners and losers.
Well, look, I think, first of all, everyone, I think, would agree that NAFTA needed to be updated. It's 24 years old. As Nanda said, there were entire sectors, like the e-commerce sector, that didn't exist when NAFTA was created. And so I think this is a positive step forward. I think from the U.S. perspective, it gave U.S. dairy farmers marginally more access to the Canadian market than existed before. I think for shippers, it was good. I think for, in a lot of areas, it helped lock in openness and made it more difficult for future administrations of any of the countries to close off markets or to put down restrictions, for example, on the flow of data between countries, or to require data localization. That's so important, I think, for the new economy and the digital economy, to be able to have free flow of data across borders. And so there's a lot of, I think, positive update that is in there. I think the fact that the aluminum and steel tariffs are still in place, the fact that the tariffs on autos are potentially hanging over the countries, I think that sort of just creates some instability. The fact that there is a sunset clause in there that kicks in after a number of years wasn't exactly the way the American administration originally proposed it, but it does create some uncertainty that will affect, I imagine, business investment decisions and decisions about where they put their supply chains.
What do you think, Annette, of that?
I think they're on balance. I think if you look in isolation, you can identify areas, you know, where there's people, losers. I think the dairy industry is challenged, but I really feel
The Canadian dairy industry is challenged.
Industry, but relative to the negotiations we had in Europe and in Asia, you know, we sort of saw this had to be done. And you know, as a farmer's daughter, it's very difficult for me to say that. But look, I think in negotiations there is give, there's take, and there are a number of things that I feel have built up security in the auto industry. You know, the bilateral the discussions between Mexico and Canada could really be a benefit to the Canadian auto industry and U.S.
Meaning because in Mexico they have to raise wages, and this will be a good thing for
That's
Canada.
correct. And so I think it's stabilization, and having this agreement, absolutely, Michael, is the number one issue. I think it's like every opportunity. You know, we have a deal now. We can build our businesses. There is security. The investment issue was really critical to get this thing done. And, you know, on balance, I think all three countries have done well. And, you know, you talk about the North American bloc. I've always envisioned the North American bloc being a powerful bloc in the world against Asia and Europe. And, I think, finding ways in which we can use that power and influence is key. And trade creates peace. I am a big believer in that. I've always supported free trade, freer trade. And if we don't continue to push that envelope as three countries, I think we could be at a disadvantage.
Let's talk about China a bit. So there's that provision in the new agreement that seems to limit a free trade agreement between Canada and China. Yet we also see a rise in Canadian exports to China, and some people speculating that China is somewhat, the numbers are still small, but potentially beginning to replace the U.S. as a trading partner in some sectors. How does China play into this?
So we look at it, as a long game, right? So there's been plenty of opportunity and plenty of occasions where there's been disagreements between countries and different wants out of trade deals. I do believe, the me first mentality is not necessarily going to be good for anybody. But what I can say is, instead of, at least my personal opinion, we should not be focused on, or the U.S. should not be focused on, reducing the number of imports or exports out of China into the U.S., but rather looking at ways to export more U.S. goods to China and, try to correct that implied imbalance through a better trade relationship.
So, Mike, and also, if you could address, the TPP and all this, because TPP actually it left China out on purpose, and you also see this administration kind of singling out China, with Vice President Pence's speech last week in particular, which some people have characterized as Cold War II, but that all of this stuff is about China at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think perhaps the most significant question we face in the international economic system is how to accommodate the rise of China, which plays by a fundamentally different set of rules than the rest of the international economy. And I'm not sure any of us have figured out the right answer. In previous administrations, it was a policy of engagement, with the hopes that over time they would become more liberal, more open, more similar to the international rules-based system, more like us. That progressed to a certain degree, but at some point it stopped or even went backwards. So I think a number of the concerns that the Trump administration has raised about China are real and legitimate. We may differ over the tactics. We're now in a tit-for-tat tariff situation, which I think we have to remember. Tariffs are hard to eliminate once they get put on. We have a 25% tariff in the United States on trucks, on pickup trucks, because of the chicken war of 1963 with the European Union.
Wow.
They didn't let our chicken in. We put a 25% tariff on their trucks. Now we have 25% tariff 55 years later. And
that's a good lesson.
There's a lesson there to be learned. I think the bigger question right now is certainly putting tariffs on exports from China has gotten the attention of the Chinese leadership. And now the question is, what is it that we're trying to negotiate? One Chinese interlocutor of mine last year said, "We understand how important it is for President Trump to have tweetable deliverables." Which I thought was a wonderful phrase. And they said, "We're perfectly prepared to give him tweetable deliverables. We just need to know what the price is." I think they had hoped that if they could reach an agreement to buy more airplanes and more soybeans and a few other things, more tractors from the U.S., that would dissipate the conflict. But I think what has emerged of late is that the administration is really looking to have China revisit fundamental elements of its industrial policy. And that's a much harder negotiation to undertake because China believes its industrial policy has served it well. It has served it well because of the system that the US and Canada, Europeans and others have maintained in terms of an open rules-based system, which is now at risk. And so this is going to be the more fundamental question of can we have a dialogue about their industrial policy, and to what degree are they willing to change that to be a more constructive stakeholder in the global trading system?
So given all of this turmoil and uncertainty in it, how should companies be reacting? Global companies.
Yeah, I think companies, look, I have found in my time in China, look, you sit down with them, understand what they want, you understand what you want. There is that collaboration, that ability to communicate, and you have to keep pushing hard. It's not easy, there's no question, but it is building its middle class. It will be, it's today the second biggest trader in the world, and if we ignore it, I think we are really will hurt the planet, ourselves, and China. And so I just believe it's and there are great companies that are in there working in China today. I would encourage people to continue. I would like the alignment to be more specific. I think that government policy needs to be more aligned with a more open position. And I think the more we do that, I think the greater chances we'll have. I don't like this idea of Cold War. We don't want China to go inward. We want to continue to draw with them. In the case of Canada, there's talk about the Section 32, and the restriction of Canada to do a full trade agreement. And I think Canada really needs to look at certain sectors, maybe start with natural resources, see if they can figure out a way they can develop some sort of trade agreement with that sector. Doing a full-fledged, free trade agreement at this point probably doesn't make any sense. But I think companies still need to push. It is tough. Home Depot was in there. They moved out. Many companies have been successful. Many companies have not. But it is eventually going to be, I think, an amazing market. And if you lose that perspective, I think we lose a lot in our world.
Did you want to add something to?
I would just say, it's of utmost importance for companies to, really adapt to the changing landscape as they have in the past, and has allowed a lot of companies to be successful and continue winning. China is a huge market. It definitely needs focus, and you just can't ignore the size of that market. But it's not impossible to navigate through the trade rules and have a successful business. What clearly will continue to happen is customers will continue to trade country to country all over the world. That's not something that I don't think would ever stop. The rules might be different. But if the companies are out there that are willing to adapt, willing to provide the service for customers and allow them access to those markets, those are the companies that are going to win in the end.
Mm-hmm. There's other topics I want to get into. I want to bring in the audience, though. Any questions? Or let me ask you one other thing while they're thinking about their questions.
It's not
Trade
a drone
flows.
question,
Yeah, it's not a drone. We're going to start on drones if we stay here too long. Because you think we overestimate drone potential, which is really interesting.
For now.
Okay. So, but you're also a shipping company. What kind of trade flows are you seeing that are surprising?
So nothing that's materially surprising now. Customers are really resilient. They continue to use our trade lanes where we have our network. And any given day, we've got 3% of the global GDP in the UPS network. And they're flowing in many different directions. Nothing material that would stick out and say, hey, there's some real hard issues to deal with. I think it's our job to ensure that that stays that way, that we position our business where our customers need us. We'll continue to talk to customers. We'll continue to work with governments to allow for those trade flows to continue on. And that's it. So nothing really that's kind of out of the ordinary.
Questions? Please identify yourself too.
Okay, I have a question. I'm the CEO of ICBC Canada. My mother bank is the largest bank in China. Thank you for your view on China. I would like to ask the panelist from the UPS. Have you felt any challenge from the emerging of the e-commerce distribution in China? I know UPS used to be very successful in China, but I guess maybe you feel a big challenge today.
Good question. Is there a challenge from distributors out of China for e-commerce?
Not so much. I think the U.S. and their policies of raising the de minimis this last, I think it's been a full year now, Mike, has helped actually shippers out of China do business in the U.S. and other parts of the world. Also going into China. So there is, again, a need for customers to trade, and that won't stop because on any given day, anybody can really just start up a business by opening up a website, and their world becomes their market. That's right. And so, you know, we're there to kind of help that along for the right reasons. But in China, I wouldn't say we used to be successful. I'd say we're even more successful now. In addition, you know, recently, about a year ago, coming up on a year, we entered into a joint venture with SF Express, which is, you know, the UPS domestic company of China. So we're still very bullish on our prospects there and competing in that market.
Yeah. Michael, with all this uncertainty around the world, particularly on trade, you suggest some private-public partnerships that could help ease the navigation?
Right. Well, look, I think at a time when there are frictions in the trading system, it puts, and you look around, there's not a lot of leadership at the international level. A lot of domestic governments are turning inward. This isn't just a comment about the United States, but if you look at Europe, you look elsewhere, there's a lot of polarization and paralysis within countries. It just puts the onus more on the private sector to step up to see what it can do in its commercial interest that also addresses these challenges. And I'll just say that we've come together with Microsoft and with a long list of banks and B2B networks to produce a platform that greatly reduces frictions at the border, makes it much easier for small and medium-sized businesses to participate in global trade and become part of.
And what is this called?
It's called MasterCard Track.
Okay.
And it allows small businesses to upload into global supply chains much more easily than they currently do, and allows companies to manage their risk of their supply chains and to see the flow of funds and payments, to know what their cash flow is or what's outstanding. And it's been rolled out now in Singapore as the first test case, and Singapore always known for being on the cutting edge of innovation when it comes to being a trading hub. And we're working with countries and port authorities and others around the world to roll it out elsewhere. So I just use it as an example of one thing the private sector can do to work with government authorities to try and eliminate barriers at the border at a time when that seems very much necessary.
Great. Other questions? Right. We just already had over here.
Patrick Quinlan, CEO at Conversant. Quick question on, I can't remember the new NAFTA, I'll just call it that.
USMCA.
Can you explain, I've read multiple articles around this quote unquote kind of blocking mechanism for individual countries to do their own trade agreements. Could you just give us a little, like, how clear is that, and what are those is it a chess move to block something? If you could kind of share your opinion on that, I would appreciate it. Yes, please.
Yeah, I don't think it is as significant as some of the reports of it are. First of all, no country negotiates a trade agreement in secret. It's sort of well known, and every country indeed has its own domestic processes for informing the public or its parliament, or in our case, Congress, about its intent to negotiate a trade agreement. So it's not as though Canada would be able to negotiate a trade agreement with China without the U.S. knowing about it. And as the Prime Minister said earlier, under the USMCA, as in the old NAFTA, any country can withdraw from the agreement on 6 months' notice for any reason. So this does put an emphasis, it sends a message that you're either with us or not with us. But the fact is, right now, if Canada were to start negotiations with China towards an FTA, and the administration in the United States felt that was somehow a threat to our own market because of transshipment concerns or other concerns, it could withdraw from the USMCA, or it could withdraw from NAFTA. And so I think it's a bit more symbolic than it is actually real in terms of its difference.
Any questions? What about Brexit? There's obviously a lot of uncertainty there as well. What would you counsel companies dealing with Brexit? I haven't, Annette and then Nando.
Well, I don't do much business in Europe, so I'll defer to my colleagues.
You've just put a large investment into France.
We have.
Symbolic?
We also invested in the UK, so about 140 million pound state-of-the-art facility. Again, we obviously are watching very closely. I think we're very concerned for small customers that, again, will have to navigate more difficult circumstances to get their products to market. I think the big enterprises will figure it out, and they can because they have the resources to do that. What is required, though, whatever happens, there needs to be a smooth transition from what's happening today, because it's so interconnected, Europe and in the UK, that if you just unraveled it or tried to do it in one day, it would be pretty catastrophic. On the other hand, if it's smooth, if the rules are such that business can continue with minimal disturbance, then it should be okay. Now, we don't just throw down investments for the sake of throwing down investments. I mean, we invested there with a view of the future. We believe that, again, it's a long game. There's a disagreement. There'll be disagreements 20 years from now. There'll be disagreements 50 years from now. But there will also be increasing trade. That's not something that's going to stop or reduce. We see that as a continuing trend well into the future, and that's where we're laying our bets.
And Michael, I'm going to put you on the spot. You have to predict on Brexit.
I'm not sure that's possible. Look, I think it would be great if we could predict a single perspective within the British government, in the EU, and in their negotiation. I think it's a very difficult situation to navigate because for the UK's perspective, obviously the rest of the EU is a critical trading partner, perhaps the most critical trading partner, and that's why there are forces that want to stay in a customs union as long as possible. But since one of the rationales for Brexit was for the UK to have its own trade policy and to be able to negotiate its own trade agreements better, more liberal, more open, trade agreements that were more in the interest of the UK, not just the other parties of the EU, that's impossible to do if you're part of a customs union. Because what a customs union means is that you've delegated your trade policy to the EU. The EU sets the tariffs. You don't get to set the tariffs. And so the UK fundamentally has to figure out which path they're on. Do they want to have their own trade policy, or do they want to remain a part of the EU's customs union? From the US perspective, about 25% of our exports to the EU are exports to the UK. So the UK is a critical trading partner for us. And once it's out of the European Union, one way or the other, I imagine there will be a desire to negotiate a bilateral trade agreement, or as Prime Minister Abe raised, for the UK to be invited into the Trans-Pacific Partnership or other trade agreements around the world.
So as we run low on time, I'm going to ask each one of you to give us a final quick thought, piece of advice on company leaders, global company leaders in this turbulent environment, except for Nando. When I get to you, you have to tell us when we're going to have drones dropping packages at our door.
All right.
Yeah.
Annette.
Diversity is key. I think Nando's comments on, we have to focus on exports as opposed, let's not take a defensive position. Let's take an offensive position. And I think, Canada has enormous opportunity to become offensive with this new trade agreement. But I think it comes from the wants and wishes of customers and citizens in our markets. Diversity is key. I'm on the board of Liberty Mutual, and we have operations throughout Europe. And I'll tell you, there are times that we're in certain countries that we have challenges. But it's amazing how business can drive through that. Yeah. Amazing how business can find in this new world that is borderless. The digitization and the focus of this new environment, the innovation will drive new business, drive continuation.
And Mike,
of growth.
very fast piece of advice.
I think the business community has largely taken the global trading system for granted up until recently. I think one of the silver linings of what we've seen over the last couple of years is that people are really beginning to have a conversation and a debate about different approaches to global trade and just what's at stake for companies, for consumers, for workers. That's a healthy debate to have, but I think going forward we need to make sure that all stakeholders are very much at the table promoting a strong rules-based system that, in the Prime Minister's words, allows growth to benefit everybody.
2 sentences on the advent of drone-delivered packages.
So never say never, right? But you're never going to see 30 million drones flying around, at least in our lifetime. But we do actually make some drone deliveries now for humanitarian relief and also testing. We do.
But I'm talking about on my doorstep. No, not for a while.
Well,
okay.
never say never,
Great,
right?
okay.
But, it would take quite a bit to deliver out of our.
We're getting the cut now.
Yeah.
Thank you, all three of you, so
Drones will be
much.
brown, though, right?
Drones will be brown. You can count on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all three of you.